Thanks ever so much, Bruce, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world today. And thank you ever so much for joining this third session of the UN-GGIM high-level forum in virtual format. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this event this afternoon. We first met 2 weeks ago, for those of you who were able to join us, where we explored the geospatial landscape impacting on the GGIM world in which we live. We received some strategic overviews at that time, both from Greg Scott on the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework and myself on the future trends in geospatial information management. Last week, we had a fantastic session really exploring the integrated framework in far more detail and diving into the various strategic pathways. This event is dedicated towards exploring the future trends in geospatial information management. And for those of you who are familiar with that work, you will understand that this is the third time that we at Ordnance Survey have revised the Future Trends report for the GGIM community. I hope this afternoon we have a number of delegates similar to those that we had last week. We had almost 700 delegates tuned in for the IGIF session last week, which is fantastic, from over 90 different countries, which is more than I think we had hoped for when we put this virtual format together. And you're all very welcome this afternoon. I just have a few overview slides just to bring some context. For those of you who joined us 2 weeks ago, forgive my 2 or 3 minutes worth of introduction, which is a slight recap. Perhaps some of you this afternoon are unfamiliar with this work. The Future Trends report is a consensus-driven report across the GGIM community to really try and capture the expert opinions on the mid to long-term developments that are happening both in the technology and the non-technology environments, which will have an impact on our work as a community. It's not intended to be a futurology report as such, but more grounded in the specific links between particular trends and their impact on our collective work. This is the third time we have updated the report. We've worked really collaboratively, we hope, across the GGIM community. Many of you will have taken part in workshops during last year, and thank you for everyone who has contributed in writing, sharing their own insights, their own experiences that we've been able to capture and build on over the last 12 to 18 months or so as we've been pulling this together. Now, this report, this diagram is going to hopefully be something that those of you who have already had a chance to review the report will be familiar with, and it's something that we're going to use in a little bit more detail this afternoon as we go through it. In the report, you'll have noticed that we've grouped a number of trends against 5 areas of drivers: the rise of new data sources and analytical methods, and technological advancement in itself, the evolution of user requirements, structural shifts in our industry, and the legislative environment, which is all around the work that we do. And we're going to talk a little bit around those groupings, if you like, and explore that at a high level, but then zone in on a number of the trends which have been important to the authors as we go through it. I think in the first session 2 weeks ago, there were some really helpful questions which were asked of the presentation we're making, and I also captured some of this coming up in the conversation last week that Greg was having with some of the authors of the main pathways and the integrated framework. I think it will be really interesting this afternoon for us to reflect, if you like, that some of the biggest disruptions, if you like, or that and the biggest impacts and the biggest opportunities which face us as a community in our work is when some of these innovations, some of these trends come together and create something that really is quite discontinuous in terms of its change, really impactful change. And Leslie Arnold last week really noted that relationship between the discontinuous change and the opportunity for many nations to leapfrog forward in their geomaturity and make rapid progress in crossing the geospatial digital divide. And I think that in itself is a really helpful thought, I hope, to kind of stay with us and perhaps guide some of our thinking in this afternoon's session. I'm delighted this afternoon, this morning, this evening, depending where you are, to open the session with three speakers who are expert in their own rights. Jeremy Morley is going to kick things off in just a moment. Jeremy is going to speak a little bit more about some of the technical trends that we've identified in this year's report. George Percivall has agreed to join us from the OGC, and George is going to specifically look at some of the trends which are impacting Earth observation. And then we're going to close this session, the first part of this afternoon's session, with a talk from Kristen Water, who's been the editor-in-chief, if you like, the main author here at Ordnance Survey of our collective inputs. And Kristen is going to talk a little bit about some of the non-technical trends which are impacting and that we've captured in the report. So I'd just like to introduce Jeremy to kick things off. Jeremy is our Chief Geospatial Scientist at Ordnance Survey, well known throughout the geospatial industry. Jeremy's been leading geospatial research in academia and government for much of the last 25 years. He's contributed significantly to the Review of Future Trends report and has agreed this afternoon just to talk a little bit more about some of the technology trends he sees as most significant to our medium-term future. And I'll just hand over to you, Jeremy, at that point.
Thanks, David. So yes, I'll talk a bit about some of the technical trends on the left-hand side of the diagram here. And there are far too many here to go through individually in detail, so we thought we would pick trends out from the one each from the three different pillars. So from the data sources, I'll talk about some of the new opportunities for data gathering. And then from user requirements, I'll talk a bit about kind of indoor and outdoor and the meeting between those two different environments. And then finally, we thought we'd talk about something a bit further off and talk about quantum computing for those that like the futurology side of things. I think we could equally have chosen topics from across this list, but we thought that maybe these would be perhaps less familiar to people and maybe provoke some extra discussion. And in the report, there's also this diagram that discusses things in terms of predictability and impact. And we've gone for things that are above the line for impact, kind of higher impact things. And you can see here there's a spread across the predictability here. And to trail ahead, here's George's talk next, which will talk about some of the Earth observation trends in this picture as well. So in terms of data gathering then, I was going to particularly talk about one pattern of that. Even within that, there are clearly at the moment a number of different opportunities around data gathering, including the kind of devices that we carry with us so ubiquitously these days, and many other things like drones and so on as well. But I thought I'd talk about this particularly of vehicles as sensor platforms. And we see in this diagram here just one example of how cars, even this day, even at the moment, and as we move towards more automation in vehicles, are big sensor platforms in themselves, with a whole mix of sensors, cameras at least, possibly laser scanners, radar systems, ultrasonics, all sorts. So these things are increasingly moving around our streets, collecting data as they go. Now, mostly at the moment, that data is for use in the second and then thrown away. But the question we might pose here is, what could we do with these things as ubiquitous sensor platforms? And this is not necessarily for automated cars. A lot of current vehicles as well have the surround cameras and ultrasonics and so on as well. So here we see some experimental work that we've been involved with at Ordnance Survey using this street drone car that you see in the top right, which is an open hardware platform for experimentation with open software stack on it as well. And you see in the main diagram the color rings that show the kind of ranging of the instruments, the mapping of the instruments at that moment in time at that position, and then the accumulated data that is this kind of gray pattern in the background. And you see this is doing a pretty interesting job of mapping. The question we might ask, though, is this complete enough? And of course, that depends on what you want to do. If you're interested in the street side and the street scene and what's going on with the streets, then clearly the vehicle view gives you very good information. But what you're not getting here is things like tops of buildings, and there's lots of occlusion. And so I think a key part of this trend is not just the opportunities of these new sensors, but the challenges posed by data fusion and how to maintain quality, and what does quality mean in a multi-sensor data fused environment like this. It's not as simple, say, for national mapping as going out with surveyors, airborne photogrammetry, collecting well-formed data. You know, how do we manage quality in this environment? And at the moment, these vehicles are going out, and as they collect the information, this is mostly for the purpose of keeping the vehicle on the road, allowing it to understand the driving environment, to not hit things, keep going, take the corners correctly, and so on. But can we use these sensor systems to more specifically map things that are interesting for kind of national or commercial mapping? So here we see some experimental work we've been involved with Mobileye, an Intel company, to use some of their image detection systems on camera systems that have been potentially retrofitted into things like utility vehicles, to then start doing roadside mapping of the roadside furniture, the things like the traffic lights and road markings and so on. The tricky thing we find here is that what you're seeing on the left-hand side, this relative view, are all of these detections of relevant objects in the car viewpoint. Actually putting those into the absolute projection viewpoint or latitude, longitude, well located, that is a significant challenge. To locate both the vehicle and then the camera pose within the vehicle is definitely part of the challenge here. And this, again, is part of that data integration, fusion, and kind of varied data quality environment that this world presents. So what we then start to see in this environment is that we end up having to take multiple data sources from maybe the vehicles, maybe other kind of opportunistic sources, and combining them into some reference store to produce the 3D features that then we can send out to the users. This diagram particularly was to do with self-driving vehicles, and so you see the users at the bottom are particularly relevant to that kind of space. But I think nonetheless, this comes back to the point that's raised in the report about ensuring consistent, accurate data, and good metrics about data quality will be really important here. The report itself talks about displaying data quality indicators for users, but of course the users here might be machine to machine. So how do we also transmit that information well between machines? And furthermore, there's a background question of transmission of data. How do we get the right information over limited bandwidths off the vehicles and into the internet system through edge computing and cloud computing and so on? That is a key part of all of this as well. So to move on to the next example of talking about indoors and outdoor experience, I think it's easy in this area to focus on visualization and navigation. I thought I'd take a slightly different tack here of actually connected data streams. So in the world of building information modeling and building management, we start to find buildings that are increasingly modeled fully in 3D with sensor systems throughout. So this is the Urban Sciences building at Newcastle University, which is a highly instrumented building, sensors throughout. How can we connect that? Or here similar example at University College London. How can we connect buildings like this into the wider geospatial world, and particularly the utility world? So this is some research, for example, being done at Newcastle University by Tom Gilbert there, in trying to connect the building information systems to the external utility environment. Should be a simple matter of finding the connection point and connecting these data sets together. Of course, these are different information realms. The whole representation of these networks is difficult. And so you get into semantic matters of the modeling and to connect the sensor data to that external network to start to look at performance and load on the network in a more geospatially complete way. Of course, there's background issues here of where do you actually know where the utility network runs, and is that well mapped, which is maybe a slightly separate issue. Once you can do that, maybe we can then start tapping into urban observatories where we're looking at weather conditions and so on, connecting that with models of energy use in buildings, now with connected to the instrumentation of buildings. And from that, building up pictures of city energy use and starting to explore issues connected with climate change, sustainability, and so on, of how well are we using energy and how could we affect that energy use. The modeling from the ground up, from the building up, helps us answer some of those questions. And a lot of this is then intrinsically very geospatial, from the information about the buildings, the modeling of the building shape and the structure of the building intensively involves geospatial information. And finally, a lot of this is affected by human behavior. Knowing when people are in buildings is important. What can we do in a private and sustainable way to understand the motion of people, where people are occupying spaces? And this is very relevant at the moment in our strange situation with the coronavirus, of understanding activity in places as well. One thing we'd like to know more about is how has occupation, both of things like here, hospitals, but also supermarkets, other utility spaces, been affected by our changed behavior, the necessities of the coronavirus situation. So I'll move on to my last example here from the third of the columns and talk a bit about quantum computing and why this might be relevant to our future. So this is a long-term trend, most definitely. So quantum computers, instead of storing traditional bits like a transistor, which is either on or off, a 0 or 1, stores information that is a mix of the 0 and 1. And this means you can run computations on all the possible states of the computer all at once. And this allows us to carry a much larger range of computations within the same number of qubits as bits, a 2 to the n scaling. So there's an exponential scaling of power potentially with the number of qubits in the machine. Unfortunately, at the moment, this is still experimental work. These things require very specialized hardware. Super chilled ions or superconductors is the sort of thing that's carried out in big labs, either in physics labs or the likes of IBM and Google at the moment. This is not immediate, but the power of these things and the kind of use cases they may apply to could be quite significant to us in the future. The good sorts of algorithms that are open to quantum computing are things like optimization problems, which are frequently a part of logistics and so on, so touches very much on networks and geospatial information, but also machine learning. So you'll see the bottom example here. There's already been a publication to show a replacement for the k-means algorithm that many of us will have been familiar at least with in Earth observation, key part of data science, for a quantum version of that q-means with exponential speed up of those algorithms. So clustering on Earth observation data, for example, would become significantly faster with these things. If you're looking for a primer, IBM provides some good resources, Google as well as leaders in the field. I think from this introduction video, I pulled out this particular quote from the Professor Gervin, the interview at Yale University, that quantum computers are really at the stage equivalent to digital computers of the vacuum tube or transistors, and still the research is even just trying to invent integrated circuits and a way to scale this thing. IBM's best computer at the moment, the best quantum computer in the world currently, only has 53 qubits at the moment. So we're back right at the beginning of this this particular trend. So I think in conclusion, there are many interesting technical trends in this. I think the thing I'd pull out is that a lot of where this is going is about integration of information, about fusion, and about how we understand quality well in this future environment, whether it's that indoor and outdoor, we're talking about fusion of data between quite different realms, or those multi-sensor opportunities, that actually it's not just about those individual new ways of collecting and managing data, it's how you put it together and understand data quality, and the representation of that in future will be quite a critical component. So with that, I'll pass back to David. Thank you.
Okay, so listen, Jeremy, thank you ever so much for that insight. It occurs to me, and actually it really resonated strongly when you were summarizing some of those trends. I mean, there's a number of things that come alive with case studies and examples, and that's something which I think we've tried to reflect in the Future Trends report, and certainly with the references towards the end, try to draw out some of the examples where we've seen some of these trends in action. And again, thank you to those of you who have shared those examples with us. Jeremy, thank you for that. I'd just like to take the opportunity, I guess, to plug at the bottom of the screen you're all looking at, the question box that's available for us. In around half an hour, we'll have the opportunity to have a conversation with Jeremy, George and Kristen, who are speaking in this first section, and just ask them any sort of questions which have come through from the audience joining us today. So feel free to share those questions. I can get access to those in real time, and then share that back with the speakers in 20 minutes or so. So moving on, I think one of the technology trends which really starts to present itself strongly in this third edition is that of Earth observation more generally. And I'm delighted this afternoon to be able to welcome and introduce George Percivall, who's the Chief Technology Officer and Chief Engineer of the Open Geospatial Consortium, OGC. George has many years of professional and personal interest in Earth observation and sensing systems generally. And when putting today's programme together, we were particularly interested we might draw on the insights recently gleaned from the OGC New Space workshop, which took place a few weeks ago. Which seemed to kind of resonate and draw out many of the themes that we'd experienced capturing the third edition of the report. So with that, I'd just like to hand over to George and invite George to kind of talk us through the developments that were unearthed at the New Space workshop, and hopefully give some greater colour just to the trend, which is under the umbrella heading of Earth observation. Over to you, George.
Thank you, David. Appreciate the invitation. It's good to see you again and to participate in this GGIM activity. And so let me speak from an OGC point of view, but you'll see that we have much in common, right? In particular, if you look at the lower left here, the acronym FIND is something I think that we share, FAIR, is something that we share between GGIM and OGC, in particular, the objective to make geospatial information findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so many of you are familiar with OGC as a consortium of organizations. A third of our members are government agencies, a third are industry, and a third are research organizations, which from an innovation and trends point of view really provides a rich discussion and a basis to look towards where geospatial information and the application of that information is going in support of critical decisions like those supported by the UN. We will see as we go forward very common approach. We'll see some commonalities. Good, there's differences actually in the aspect of trend forecasting, technology forecasting. OGC conducts a technology forecasting activity in terms of three major steps. We have a breadth phase, and so we look widely and identify as many trends really as possible that are relevant to geospatial information. And so there we're looking at about 50 or so trends that we kind of keep an eye on. In the assessment phase, we want to look to see which of those trends are moving forward, which are those that look synergistic, because one of the criteria you always see with respect to trends is when they come together and form some kind of a cluster, they tend to move forward a little more rapidly than not. Individual trends on their own tend to languish. The iPhone was a collection of many technologies that really produced quite an overall innovation. And then, of course, we want to take action. We want to focus. We want to identify those things that really move things forward. And as part of that focus activity, we'll see the workshop that David just mentioned as a key aspect about community involvement, getting the community involved, and collectively identifying where we're moving forward. So let me take you through a little bit of that, starting with breadth. And we tend to track, like I said, about 50 or so trends in these 8 categories. And these are really geospatial information categories. And a lot of things that Jeremy was talking about, the indoor spatial temporal models is a key part of that, data science and analytics, big data computing. Sensing and observations will be the one that are really focused on here. It was out of that trend that we identified the opportunity to hold a workshop. Was going to be a 2-day in-person workshop last month. Turned out to be a virtual, right? So here we are. This was the event, and the results are online. It was the New Space Workshop, held virtually over 2 days, 3 sessions, each session about 2 hours apiece. And lots of webinar, lots of Zoom, right? So there you go. Let me spend a little bit of time, though, on the workshop and the contents of that workshop. Excuse me. So 3 sessions. I'll address each of those in turn. First is technology in space. And so what we've seen there is new ways to get to space, new launch vehicles, commercial launch vehicles, as well as the small sat revolution, the ability to put a smaller satellite, with a more limited budget, on space, in space, on orbit, really has opened up space in a brand new way. The other aspect is the new sensors that are being put on those platforms. And so we speak of those new sensors as different phenomenologies. And so optical, we're very familiar with, right? Infrared and the like is kind of the what we most see, right? Is visible wavelength kind of sensors. But 2 in particular are coming on based upon this workshop. One is SAR, so synthetic aperture radar, the ability to see through clouds, not to be limited by the need to have the sun illuminating the location. So SAR in a small sat by a commercial vendors is really a race to space that's going to change and give us new data that we didn't have before. Another one that was really interesting was the greenhouse gas sensor that was able to identify greenhouse gas sources at the resolution of kilometers, which is pretty amazing. If you're thinking about gas and coming out of a smokestack and light, and the ability to monitor those carbon releases at that scale is really going to be a game changer with respect to climate change. So that's session 1, technology from space. So session 2 was data curation and processing. So you've gotten that data to the ground. You need to deal with it as big data. And we certainly have that technology now to deal with big data cloud computing, putting, I should call out the folks that are here on the right. This is the list of organizations that participated, but at the top of that list was Maxar. And Maxar Kumar Nabular in particular was one of the organizing primary organizers of this workshop, along with Nadine Alamé, our OGC CEO. But I point to that list and Maxar in particular because Maxar, that is Digital Earth, transferred their archive tens of petabytes into the cloud, right? And so that kind of cloud-hosted data, the data gravity, pulling the processing to the cloud where the data is hosted, has made a huge change in what kind of analytics we can do at scale on Earth observation data. Big data, or Earth observation's always been big data. Now we have the analytics to deal with that. So we need analysis-ready data. We need to have that data ready for application by users. Analytics-optimized data services is another way to say that ARD phrase. And so we focused a lot on that. The whole transition here is to go from data to information to some kind of knowledge, which brings us to session 3, which was all about geospatial data science. We've had a separate workshop about geospatial data science and a white paper coming out about that. The 2 topics that really came out here with respect to Earth observation data are machine learning and visualization. So we're familiar with machine learning, a type of artificial intelligence that has really revolutionized the analysis of imagery data. Again, because of the processing scale, the ability to do it in the cloud, but also because of that technology of machine learning based upon neural networks, we're able now to have tens of thousands of nodes in those neural networks, which are able to do analytics and feature identification and other types of analysis that we couldn't do at that scale before with the accuracy that we couldn't do at that scale before. It's not a panacea. There are some lessons learned with respect to the early stages of this 3rd generation of machine learning, but it really is making a difference. The other is visualization, right? One of the primary ways in which we understand geospatial information is through visualization. We certainly are familiar with maps. We love maps. We now have computers that allow us to visualize spatial data in many more ways, 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional data. And so that last session really hit a lot on the visualization using things like 3D tiles and i3s as a way to do 3D visualization, but also then how to do kind of knowledge representation as visualization. So moving from maps to models to knowledge visualization, including Earth observation data, was a key part of that. So that really was the workshop that we held 2 weeks ago, and hopefully that brings some Earth observation flavor to the trends discussion today. I'll leave you with where we're headed over the next year. We're just about ready to release a report on the emergent trend clusters from OGC. You'll see, new space exploitation up in the upper right corner is a key one. And you'll see other items here that are very synonymous with what Jeremy presented and what GGIM has prepared in their report. An excellent report from GGIM. It's a really good opportunity to participate here and build that synergy between our organizations along the lines of delivering the future of geospatial information. So back to you, David.
George, thank you very much indeed. And I think, I think that was great. It was just a very sharp insight into some of the very many trends which are kind of collating around the space of Earth observation. I think our observation and from the inputs across many contributors to the Future Trends report has been that there are many national and international developments in this space, and there's a huge amount of continuous development, but especially continuous availability of Earth observation data now. And I think that's something which you brought out really well in the summary from the event a few weeks ago, and it's something which I think we'll return to throughout several of the speakers this afternoon. It's my real pleasure now to switch track a little bit away from technology, and I think one of the challenges when we talk about trends that are impacting, particularly in the geospatial sector, we often start to focus in naturally on the technology trends. I'd like to introduce now Kristen Water, one of my colleagues at Ordnance Survey, and very importantly for all of us in this community, Kristen has been the lead author for all of us in terms of this 3rd edition. Kristen has the unenviable task at times of sifting through very much insight that has been provided to her by the community, working with commercially available insight, and trying to determine a consensus view of the insight and how it relates to the work of GGIM in particular. And this afternoon, Kristen's just going to highlight and perhaps some of those trends that are most pertinent in a non-technical sense for us to consider. With that, over to you, Kristen.
Hello, David. Thank you so much. Let me see. All right, here we go. So, as Jeremy has just pointed out, we're really using this slide that most of you can probably see as one of the main tables in the report to really structure how we are describing the technical and non-technical trends that we see emerging. So, as Jeremy has focused on the first 3 drivers, I will now be looking at the last 2, of one of which is the industry structural shift, and the other one is the legislative environment. And really based around many of the questions that you have been asking over the last 2 weeks, we've really tried to focus particularly on those trends to really draw them out and hopefully answer some of your questions. So to highlight that right now, so we're going to look at the talent and consumer shift. We're going to draw on some of the changes within our ecosystem that we've seen over the last number of years. And then when we're focusing on the legislative environment, we're going to look at the digital ethics and privacy, which has really been one of the prominent topics. So similar to what Jeremy has done is I'm doing a very brief dive into into those drivers, and then I'm really drawing out these individual trends that we're going to discuss. So as you can see on this very high level slide, and it won't come as a surprise that the industry has really gone through quite a disruptive change in a variety of different areas, whether it is map generation technologies, whether it's use cases, but also business models and user requirements. As David has just pointed out, we've really been trying to pay attention to many of the things that we've been hearing during the workshops, and really trying to pull out these developments as well as those very prominent technology trends. So this section in particular really looks at the ubiquitous nature of geospatial data and how it has really become an everyday part of services, and is really central to many business models across a variety of disruptive companies that we have seen emerge in the 2010s. And we're going to look at some of them in a little bit more detail very briefly in a minute or so. And of course, the rise of smartphones, of tablets, and of other mobile service devices has greatly contributed to people's expectations and how people would like to use geospatial applications in the future. And then, of course, we can't forget to talk about skill sets. And even though automation and artificial intelligence have generally received quite a negative notion that they're taking away jobs, actually, what we're trying to do in the report is we really try and look at the opportunities that automation and artificial intelligence can bring to the industry. One of the things that has been greatly highlighted a week ago by John Kida is the rise of partnerships, and of course the importance of partnerships and collaborations. So this section as well looks at how partnerships are changing, and over the last 2 years or so, we've really seen a big change, particularly when it comes to mapping for CAVs. We've seen the automotive industry come together, working with geospatial experts, but also bringing in the academics to provide this service to the wider economy, to the global economy. So we're really seeing how collaborations and partner agreements, R&D, is really merging together. So let's move on to the next thing. So looking at the talent and the consumer shift in more detail, we're going to draw on skills, we're going to look at innovation programs, something that Leslie Arnold a week ago also touched upon strongly, and then we're also going to briefly look at digital natives and what the rise of a different user of data might mean for the future of our industry. So if we're starting with skills in particular, there have been a variety of different studies over the last number of years. And some of these studies really highlight that over the next few years, it is estimated that around 50% of the working population in many parts of the world will actually need reskilling, just because of that significant impact of digital transformation. And as I've just pointed out, the increase in automation and artificial intelligence further out in the future actually provides us a huge opportunity and great positive changes. For example, ongoing automation of collection processes and basic data interpretation elements of artificial intelligence are able to replace the human factor in repetitive tasks, and therefore enables the greater lifelong learning. It enables reskilling and upskilling of employees to perform high-value tasks when it comes to the use, the creation, and the maintenance of spatial information and related services. However, we also need to look at another more challenging part of this development. As some parts of the world, for example, are experiencing a lack of qualified people who are able to effectively manage and utilize geospatial information, other parts of the world actually see a struggle in the retention rates of professionals. And national mapping agencies or national government bodies, these could also include statistical offices, of course, actually at a risk of losing top artificial intelligence and data science talents, because the private sector often provides better pay or has more attractive career paths. So we're really seeing over the long term, over the next 5 to 10 years, major challenges arising for the public sector in increasing the number, in really keeping those key experts. If we're now looking at a different side of skills and focusing on the education and the curriculum program, we can actually see that the geospatial industry overall is increasingly calling for the academic sector to take more account of the fast pace of change when it comes to the use of data, but also the rise of different technologies, in order to really ensure that the education programs build capacity and develop professionals. So in order to illustrate some of the things that I'm pointing out this afternoon, I'd like to introduce a couple of different examples that we will be discussing. So if we're looking outside of the geospatial industry, we're seeing there are several sectors that are really developing industry-specific skills strategies. And really, it's all about future-proofing how the industry is developing the skills that they need in the future. So we have seen different parts within the geospatial industry actually sector skills strategy emerging. And as you can see here, EO for Geo, which is a European initiative, is one of these. So this initiative and several like these are really trying to bridge the skills gap between the supply and the demand of the education and training, and really trying to address the short, medium, and long-term skills needs by ensuring that the academic sector works together with those in the private sector, but also in the public sector, to really ensure that those who are entering the labour market have the right skills available. If we're then moving on and looking at the innovation program, as I've already pointed out, and Leslie Arnold gave a really good overview of this when she introduced the innovation pathway last week. And again, actually, if we're looking at innovation programs or innovation hubs, if I'm using those as an example, they're not necessarily a new development. However, what we have really seen over the last 5 years or so is really national agencies, whether it's geospatial businesses, national mapping agencies in particular, really creating these innovation hubs and aiming to support new and emerging startups by making funding available, but also providing mentoring. And again, just highlighting 2 examples here, Georeferenced, probably one of the earliest innovation hubs that really focused on geospatial data in particular, is one of those examples. But then, of course, GeoWorks in Singapore is another example that really builds on the same framework by bringing together the private sector, users, academia, but also government agencies, and focusing on local issues that they're trying to solve. If we're then moving on to digital natives, we really see quite a change in the way future users are wanting to use data. And one of these changes has very much to do with the improvements in the digital infrastructure and how users expect services and to be delivered to them. So of course it will come as a surprise that I'm showing apps here and mobile phone devices as an example. So what we're really seeing emerge is an expectation of this future user of data to have or to see their technology experience or being equal to their social media experience. It's about being frictionless. It's about being mobile, but also convenient. What we're seeing is in many ways is that instant gratification, having a question now and having the question answered almost immediately. Moving on to the next area, which is around the regeneration of the business ecosystem. We've really seen business models that have emerged and show how geospatial data and technologies are increasingly used across a variety of industries. Again, we've briefly touched on that earlier. But also technological advances and the advent of digital platforms in particular have drastically reduced the barrier of entry, making it easier for new players to enter the market. And if you're briefly looking at really the power of the platform business models, has really gained significantly by simply connecting producers and users. And I'm just showing 3 examples here: Apple, Microsoft, but then Amazon Web Services as well, who are those very early adopters of digital platforms. If we're then looking at more startups, who were created around 10 years ago, Uber was founded in 2008, Airbnb in 2009. So by the time the first Future Trends report was published, these were actually still very much startup businesses. To briefly highlight that as well, although Uber is a multi-billion-dollar business and it doesn't own any cars, even though it really provides the largest transportation business in the world, and similar for Facebook when it comes to content and Airbnb when it comes to rooms available. If we're focusing on the geospatial industry in particular, we're really seeing geospatial technologies and its being used more widely. So when it comes to the platform business model, companies like Uber combine geospatial analytics, location data, route networks, and other information to offer a simple solution. So looking back maybe 5 to 10 years ago, Uber is basically a combination of technologies that were all considered to be incredibly disruptive at its time. It's smartphones, GNSS positioning and navigation, online payments, cloud computing, and sharing of personal assets. We all brought together, created a multi-billion-dollar business. Really just moving on and quickly keeping an eye on the time as well, the legislative environment. So since the publication of the last Future Trends report, one thing that has really become apparent is that awareness of the potential of the social and economic value of geospatial information. And many of those strategies and those master plans that have since been made available really focus on the economic growth, the employment opportunities that geospatial can bring about, but also how it can combat societal challenges when it comes to climate change, urbanization, and resource management. And although all nations have different priorities, many of these initiatives are really about improving data and semantic interoperability, data accessibility. And in order to link this to digital ethics and privacy, really the number of connected devices and the data volume that have really started to raise questions about privacy and cybersecurity, but then also about ethics. So I've pointed out two examples here on the slide as well, and many of you will probably be aware of them. So in 1930, Edmond Locard, who's really been considered the pioneer of forensic science, determined that it actually only takes 12 points of a fingerprint to uniquely identify an individual. However, a 2013 study, and in my opinion, probably one of the most powerful, really highlighted how mobility traces are very unique to an individual, and that only takes 4 spatial temporal points to identify 95% of individuals. One thing I haven't put on the slide here is that it's about people who are moving within an area of around 100 square kilometers. And for anyone who uses a different metric system, this is roughly just above 62 miles. So what the study has really highlighted is that mobility data is probably one of the most sensitive data that is currently being collected. So even though if a data set has been anonymized, it may not contain a name, it may not contain home addresses, phone numbers, or any other identifiers, it can still be, or the movement can still be reconstructed to identify an individual. And this really raises a variety of security and privacy concerns that then relate to data ownership, to data access, and to data usage. And of course, one of the most talked about legislations that have recently come into effect is the European General Data Protection Regulation, which has been described as one of the most comprehensive, but also most restrictive laws on data protection and privacy. However, this is not the only example in the world. Australia recently amended its Privacy Act, and India introduced a personal data protection bill as well. So to start rounding up, when we're looking at digital ethics and privacy, with advancements in how data is used and deployment of emerging technology, this puts increasing pressure on understanding and anticipating, as well as responding to emerging ethical issues. And it has been said that the use of geospatial information poses serious ethical questions when it comes to privacy, to the accuracy, and to accessibility. The ethics related to geospatial information management focuses on the relationship most of the time between the creation, the organization, the dissemination, and the use of geospatial data and services, and of course the ethical standards around it. So I've just, in order to really finish this off, I've put 2 examples here as well. One of them is the Benchmark Initiative, and the other one is the American Geographical Society's Ethical Geo Initiative. And of course, these initiatives are all about improving trust among the users of location-enabled services. And it's really about almost, I'm going to use a quote here from Ethical Geo. The ethics is about how we ought to live together. And all of this really is often as an answer to the scandal that came about between the Cambridge Analytica and Facebook only 2 years ago. So this is really just a very brief overview of some of the topics that we are discussing within the Future Trends report that are non-technical, rather than the technical ones that Jeremy and George have just discussed. So thank you very much. And David, it goes back to you.
Thank you, Kristen. And listen, that was an excellent overview of some of those non-technology trends which have captured so much. And the question, you've got to be careful what you wish for. So the questions started to come alive a little bit through those last 2 talks. And you know, I'd really like just to take an observation to take a moment rather just to play some of those questions back with you all, if that's okay. So I guess, Kristen, just the first one while we have you, and in terms of the report itself, you know, can you just give us a small insight into why the report is structured, perhaps in the way it is, with the logical way in which the groupings came together, and just to give the audience a little bit of an insight into how you the structuring of those trends to support their use?
Thank you, David. Of course. So those of you who are aware with the previous Future Trends reports, you might notice that actually the structure of the content is very similar. So we haven't necessarily taken away from anything. However, we have added probably two main areas. One of them is this very first chapter, which is called Drivers and Trends and Geospatial Information Management. And you have seen two of the graphs just recently used by Jeremy and myself. And then, of course, those of you who have already started reviewing and taking a look at the draft, each individual chapter really has a very brief summary at the beginning. So we very much envisage, when it comes to just using the document the way it is, that anyone who doesn't have the time to read the entire document, because yes, anyone who started it is just under 70 pages long, and it is quite a commitment sitting down and reading it. So we do envisage that if you haven't got the time to read the entire document, you should be able to read the first chapter, and then the summary of each following chapter to just give you a fairly comprehensive overview of what the main topics are that those of you who have all contributed have really brought out. When it comes to the table that you've just seen in particular, and how we've gone about drawing out these drivers and these trends, it really has been part of that engagement that we've had with many of you over the last year. You may be aware that we first started out with a literature review, then we went through a prioritization exercise, we had two discussion workshops, and of course then we've had this 2 months process of really asking for written contributions. So all of these different areas really have come together, and considering that we had 103 contributions from member state, from individual bodies, we've really tried to almost draw out what are the topics that keep coming up again and again, that you as an industry community keep talking about. So this is really how it has emerged, and David has really pointed out right now, it's about not just highlighting the technical and the data trends that we're seeing, it's also about highlighting all the other trends. I can see the probably start to go over time, so I hope this has been a good answer.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. So I think if there were two questions which seems to have come up time and time again in different forms within the chat, and I think it really applies to George and Jeremy in particular, was first of all almost the and I'll try and phrase this as a question, but is there an inevitable conclusion to the sense of persistent, continuous observation at citizen level, whether that's from Earth observation, space-based, airborne, ground-based? Jeremy, you talked initially about vehicle sensors. So this sense that data is everywhere. And at the same time, Kristen almost finished by talking about some of the more challenging, if you like, privacy and ethical challenges associated with data, which directly relates to personal movement, if not personal whereabouts. Can you just maybe provide some comment and response to the very many questions and around that? And I guess that, both touching on the inevitability of sort of persistent sensing, but then also the associated challenges in terms of the governance that sits around the use of that data. Maybe Jeremy, to you first.
Okay, yes, absolutely. And I'm well aware in putting up an image showing people being with green boxes around their heads in a street scene, that immediately raises as many questions as it does technological excitement about what's going on there and who knows about it. I think and clearly there's huge issues around privacy in all of this technology. I have a different slide I sometimes show of technologies out in the world, and I think it would be possible for our lives to be monitored 24/7 by the gadgets around us before long. You know, if you have smart heating controls and so on in your house, they'll detect when you get up in the morning, and your electricity supply spikes when you maybe have a shower or something, and you get in your vehicle and it logs the fact that you're in the vehicle, and you get to work and you swipe in, and you've got sensors in the office showing how much CO2 you're breathing out and all the rest of it. So I think the first place this starts with in managing this, the privacy, is simply organizations being aware and possibly the legal structures around the handling of the data. And then I think the second principle really is throwing away the observation of who is being observed as soon as possible, and then guarding against the differential privacy of putting, you know, the two pieces of information together to pull out that identity. So, for example, in that people tracking in the street scene, you may be interested not really in who's going where, just in the volume of flows and so on. And if the algorithm that is detecting the people is actually all the way down in the camera, what the camera might be reporting out is not the green boxes around the head and so on, but might be either anonymous IDs or simply counts. If you're trying to observe people flowing across an area, then then you're going to have to link data together from one camera to the other. But doing that as early as possible, as anonymously as possible, is probably the key to a lot of this.
And George, similar, you've been taking lots of notes there as Jeremy was talking about, so a similar question to yourself.
Yeah, I appreciate Jeremy, taking it first. I guess there's a reason to be cautious and a reason to be optimistic. This persistence touching the green boxes around everybody's head and the like, there's reason to be cautious about what happens to that data. We all, loved the idea of social media that would connect us all together, and through this connectivity, we would end up having a better world. And as we found out, there was some things to be worried about, social media and the misuse and abuse of social media, right? So in a similar fashion, it's in some ways less about the data and more about its application that we ought to be concerned about. And so then maybe the positive aspect about it is that by measuring and monitoring and observing and the like, that does give us the opportunity to have a much richer knowledge of our world, right? So the ability to have models that explain the world that we live in, allow us to make better use of the scarce resources that we have, and the ability to essentially answer some of those key questions about the sustainability of the planet, for example. In the end, it comes back to, what is the social contract of participating in that great experiment of ever more persistent sensing? And there's reason to be cautious and there's reason to be optimistic.
Thank you, George. Yeah, I think it's maybe a question also that we'll come back to with some of the other talks later on this afternoon, because I think it's by far and away the most predominant of the questions which have arrived during the session is around that. I think really just conscious of time, and I think both of you, George and Jeremy, teased the audience, if you like, with the inevitable power of quantum computing, machine learning. I mean, to Jeremy, just how significant is the advent of quantum computing for the geospatial sector? Should we be rushing out, as a couple of the questions have suggested, and why one now? But perhaps more seriously, in the context of perhaps quantum computing, Jeremy, and machine learning, George, that you mentioned, just how significant are these technologies now for our sector? And what do you observe that we should be looking out for in the next couple of years?
Do you want to go first this time, actually, George? I went first last time.
Oh, sure, Jeremy. Appreciate it. Machine learning, and maybe the broader question about artificial intelligence and the like, is making a difference. There is absolutely some significantly better results using machine learning and what's called convolutional neural networks, deep networks, that kind of technology, compared with what we were able to do in the past. And that's giving us, again, a better, richer understanding of our world. At times, people are saying, well, you know, this is AI. Should I really be worried about it? I watched an interview by one of the big tech companies about AI. He said, we've had AI for many years. You get it every time you get in the car, and you get directions from these wonderful Ordnance Survey maps, for example, about which direction to go down the road. That was a form of AI. It is a form of AI. And so, you know, we continue to see technology becoming magic and giving us ways to deal with things we never had before. And yeah, I look forward to hearing Jeremy's, where should we place our bets on quantum?
Okay, well, at one end of that, the spectrum of that answer is you can try out a quantum computer now that IBM puts quantum computer facilities online for people to experiment with if they like. Now, they can't do a huge amount at the moment. 53 qubits in their latest research model is actually quite a lot when you think about that 2 to the n scaling of computation. There are the smaller ones that are online for public to use, but and there are simulation systems that allow you to simulate on a digital computer using a quantum computer. So it's something that one can start experimenting with now. These things, as they come along, are going to start in a kind of cloud model, or more like high throughput computing, where you subscribe to a service, I suspect. And quantum computers aren't going to replace digital computers. There are things that quantum computers are especially suited for in those massive computation problems that can be reduced by using the nature of the quantum computer. It's going to be down the line quite a bit before this is really in the hands of many organizations. I think, yeah, this is certainly a beyond 5-year trend for its significant impact. But now would be a good time to start looking at it. I think if you're a future-oriented organization with the capacity for these things, like I say, there are algorithms that are relevant to us, like that Q-means algorithm being produced already. You couldn't run it at scale on anything right now, but understanding where this is going gets you on the track to using these things when they come out, I would say.
Jeremy, thank you. And so, folks, that brings to a close the first session of this afternoon. I'd really like to thank all of the speakers who have shared with you their views, their insights that have informed some of the input into the Future Trends 3rd edition. When we come back after the break, we'll start to focus in on the application of some of those trends, of the considerations around building strategy, and how the trends start to inform that strategy, and how in the context of collecting and managing data and delivering insight, how we started to see some of those trends impacting. Keep your questions coming in, please. We will have the opportunity to place some more questions towards these speakers towards the end of this afternoon, if there is anything particularly around the report itself. However, I'm going to announce a break now, and give us just over 10 minutes to come back. So I won't say it's 1:20 in the afternoon in the UK, and that, I suspect, is only helpful to a huge minority of participants this afternoon. So it will be 20 past whatever hour you're currently in, 20 minutes past the hour. So that's in 12 minutes from now. We'll start back this afternoon and introduce our next speaker. Have a good break.